theater. Come, play with us. Naturally, in what you are about to see, any similarity with the truth or with real life would be purely coincidental. Do bear that in mind. So, will you come play with us? You will? Good. I thought you would. Come in, cousin. Be one of the family.
See here, Charles, do you realize what a dilemma this is? It's terribly difficult. I don't see any way out of it at all.
Come, Bern. Of course there's a way out. Now, there are 13 of us so far, right? You want to invite Edward as well, which makes 14.
Yes, but if somebody's ill, Charles, then we should be back to 13 again.
Precisely. Then we must invite more people.
That's an idea.
Now, what about Lottie and James? That'll make 16. Then if somebody's ill, well, at least we won't be 13, will we?
But then there's the problem of the rooms, Charles. Lottie has 2 children, Charles. 2 little boys. Freddie and Little John.
I don't see any problem there at all. We can put the 2 children in, well, in Helen's room, for instance. What do you think, Linda?
We're here waiting for you.
I think that...
You see, Linda agrees with me. Lottie's children must go in with Helen's children, of course. Linda's absolutely right.
But then there's the problem of the seating, Charles. I think I've got something worked out, though. Look, if we put Yvonne at the head of the table and Richard at her
Oh,
right...
no, Bernard. Richard isn't even speaking to Yvonne these days.
Oh.
Because of Leslie.
Oh.
Madeline must be at the head of the table. Besides which, Madeline is older than Yvonne. She might even be older than Jacqueline. Now, I see no problem there. We put Madeline at the head of the table. It's Madeline, isn't it, Linda?
Absolutely.
Well, if Linda thinks it's all right, well, then of course it must be. But there's still the problem about the rooms, Charles.
Well, what rooms are left? That's the pink room. We could always put Lillian in the pink room.
And we could put Susan in the green room.
Yes, but...
Where can we put Monica, you mean?
Yes. What can we do with Monica? Do you have the answer, Linda?
In the blue room?
Linda, you're right.
She's right.
Linda, you're absolutely fantastic.
And that's from Fahrenheit 451, 1966, long before the first Choose Your Own Adventure novel was published and before QuickTime events. So, games. For a very long time, perhaps since the dawn of our species, we've enjoyed this symbiotic relationship with games. We graze for our enjoyment, and they feed on our brains in order to survive. And throughout history, in one way or another, society's been uneasy with what this age-old relationship with games might be doing to us. And yet we keep coming up with new technology to house games, new ways of playing, but what exactly is going on? And maybe first of all, who am I to tell you about this terrifying yet fascinating subject? So my name is Naomi Clark. I've been making games for about 2 decades now, since I was a teenager. I've worked on about 3 dozen released games on a lot of different platforms for many different audiences, but always a little bit out on the fringes, not so much in mainstream or retail games. So I like to think that I have an interesting vantage point as an observer. This game I'm working on right now, Consentical, is a cooperative card game about humans and aliens having intimate encounters, during which, of course, my game is having an intimate encounter with your mind. But recently, I've been spending a lot of my time teaching students at the NYU Game Center in New York, where we investigate new ways to think about and make games. And this isn't really an academic talk, but some more content warnings. It's mostly a talk that draws on a lot of different disciplines with weird ideas about games. So let's get started. Play is something that's very common to many different species on this planet, a way of experimenting with goals and abilities, trying things out in a less dangerous and much more adorable context. But human beings have a very particular kind of play. We're the species that likes to make rules, that gets upset about cheating, that insists on having really important choices to decide on during the course of play, to be that decider who determines the outcome and whether we win or lose. So to the extent that if players are really dissatisfied with this aspect of a game you make, they can get very, very annoyed indeed. But why is this? Where did our species' strange way of playing come from? Well, I'm just a game designer, so I like to steal ideas from other people. And who better to steal from than Richard Dawkins, someone who is wrong about an awful lot of things, including anything that has to do with Islam or women. But on the other hand, he's made some interesting contributions, like the idea that Ideas themselves can travel around from one human mind to the next and spread like viruses. So in the interest of not throwing out the 74-year-old baby with the bathwater, I'm going to borrow some evolutionary biology from Dawkins. If you're not keen on this guy or on scientific rationales in general, you can feel free to treat this like a fairy tale about how things might work, which is a lot of what a scientific hypothesis is in any case. So here's a term that I stole from him, archaeopurpose, a way of talking about functions in the natural world. So unless you are a creationist, you don't believe that sonar was put into bats by an intelligent designer. It's the result of natural selection over many generations, and it proves very useful to bats. It has a purpose, but it wasn't on purpose. And one of the notable things that human beings evolved over a very long time was these enormous fucking heads that we have, which turns out to drastically expand a new ability called neopurpose. The ability to form neopurposes, to choose our goals, figure out how to pursue them, understand obstacles that might be in our way, try something different to get around them, to give up when necessary, and so on and so forth. So archaeopurpose, bat sonar, neopurpose, ship sonar. So here's a story about brains and games. Our brains got bigger along with our enormous skulls. We developed the world's most overpowered neopurpose ability. And we use that ability to make technology, in part to help make up for the fact that we don't have claws or fur. So we get around that by sort of ripping up chunks of the rest of the world, taking someone else's fur, et cetera, and making it into tools. And from early on, some of the tools that we made were these mystical tools, bones and shells and sticks that were used for divination. So we can think of this as an attempt to boost neopurpose further, to figure out things that might be beyond the scope of ordinary planning. What should we do and when should we do it? Is this the right time? Is it auspicious? Are we going to be lucky and find fortune, or is disaster going to strike? That could make a very big difference if you're an early human being. And it turns out that divination tools are also tied up in the origin of a lot of games. So bones used to tell the future became bones that were just used to pass the time in pleasurable play, also known as dice. So games kind of sprang up as a way of playing around with ideas that we are wondering about, from how the harvest would do, as we see in games like Mancala, to the nature of afterlife in games like Senet, which are some of the earliest board games in the world. And if we go through our history, we see this relationship between divination and games continuing. So when cards were first introduced as playing cards, they soon also evolved for another purpose, for divination, as tarot cards. And even early forms of solitaire were first used as a sort of divination tool to figure out whether you were having a lucky day or not. You got a good deal in solitaire. So I think of games as being kind of the human equivalent of a instinctive behavior, like sharpening your claws. I mean, if you've got claws, you got to keep them sharp, right? Even if you live in a house where you get fed all the time. It's just part of who you are, the kind of creature you are. So games are kind of flexing and sharpening our brain's capacity for neopurpose in a lot of different ways. Imagining potential situations that could happen someday or somewhere, thinking about what we do in those situations, making plans, failing and trying again, coming up with different approaches. And much later, technology advanced to the point where we were ripping off archaeopurposes like birds' ability to fly or bat sonar, and eventually got around to mimicking our own brains, creating computing technology that could make decisions based on inputs and sensors. And it's little wonder that this technology then led to an enormous explosion in the kinds of games that we could make and play as well, sort of boosting our capacity for sharpening and playing with our own neopurpose facilities even in an even bigger way. So that brings us close to where we are now, right? The last half of the 20th century and on to today. So there's one way to think about games is that they're flexing a certain kind of mental capacity that you have and exercising it. So if ancient games were like free weights, then the enormous digital worlds we have today are like, you know, like super complicated exercise machine that does everything you could ever want and takes up a whole bunch of time and space in your home, especially if the game is Rock Band. Or at least, that's what big, huge games claim to be, right? They sort of do everything. They're a world where you can do anything you want. I tend to think that some games are really focusing on working out certain aspects of our neo-purposeful brains and not others, which, you know, if you extend it, if you really just focus on certain types of gameplay, it could lead to a situation like this where your mind, your attitudes, your way of seeing the world could get a little bit lopsided. But you might be wondering at this point, how true is all of this? Are games really flexing or affecting our brains? It turns out the answer is definitely yes. Our brains, as it turns out, especially from research in the last decade or so, are extremely plastic. They're subject to change and growth throughout our life, maybe even more plastic than our muscles being worked out by weights. So here's some examples. One of the most commonly cited differences between men's brains and women's brains rests on this theory that men are much better at tasks that involve rotating things in space. But it turns out that if you just play Call of Duty for a few days, it pretty much erases that difference, that men and women alike all get to around the same level of spatial tasks. And this idea that games can improve our mental capabilities, certainly things like hand-eye coordination or reflexes, goes back a really long way. And so Nintendo's Brain Age franchise, for instance, is based on that idea, as are websites like Lumosity. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg in how games affect us. It turns out that games can also change our attitudes and biases, our beliefs about the world, and we can actually measure that change scientifically. So for instance, perceptions about women in science fields were measured using a card game called Buffalo. And after playing this game, which doesn't overtly appear to be about science or women at all, they measured players' biases and stereotypes about women in science before and after, and it turned out that after playing this game, the biases and negative stereotypes about women were reduced. And this team did a number of studies on various games that showed shifts about sexism in a number of ways. They found some unexpected things. So for instance, if you overload a game with female characters, you put sort of 100% female characters in a game about women in science, then the effect on gender stereotypes isn't as strong as if you have closer to a balanced mix of gender. And one of the most interesting findings was about racist and sexist attitudes, the kinds of things that show up in microaggressions, being reduced by a game that might surprise you, and that game is Cards Against Humanity. And so the hypothesis here that they were sort of thinking like might be why they found the numbers that they did was that putting players into situations where they're sort of prompted to think or say offensive things, that Cards Against Humanity is actually making players more aware of their own biases, the sort of dark thoughts lurking in the corners of your mind that get summoned up by a combination of cards, making people aware that they need to counter their own prejudices. So this may, your mileage may vary. You may not need Cards Against Humanity to do that for you, or it could certainly backfire, but it's a really interesting result that just shows the ways that games are affecting us. I could go on and on and on with more examples. Adolescents who play a lot of games show enhanced growth in the areas of their brain that have to do with decision making and planning, just like we might expect from an activity that's kind of flexing that neo-purpose. A study on people with post-traumatic stress disorder showed that playing Tetris may, for some people at least, help block the same neural pathways that activate traumatic flashbacks. So in other words, when you play Tetris until you see shapes falling, even with your eyes closed, it's actually taking up space in your brain that can't be used by something else. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for everyone as a way of reducing PTSD, but it has had this effect for some people that it sort of like just blocks out everything else. And then of course the big bogeyman of games and studies about games violence. So a bunch of studies in the last decade have showed that there's at the very least a desensitization effect from playing violent video games, that violence just doesn't bother you as much after you play a lot of a violent video game over the course of hours or weeks. There have been different studies that sort of look at different time frames. And of course, the same thing has been found to be true of other violent media. But this particular idea, the idea that, video games cause violence, is a specter that keeps coming back to haunt games culture, to the extent that a lot of the time, many people in games don't even want to talk or think about the topic, right? And that maybe it's even hard to think about this wider field of all these ways that games can change us. And last but not least, the title of this talk is not pure clickbait. There are more and more studies that show how the playing roles inside games can influence our own sexual and gender identity, the development of those things, how we come to understand those types of categories. And even if games couldn't maybe take the straightest guy you know and convert him to the gay side of the force, we still know that gay gamers like me and probably many of you, that games have been instrumental in helping us develop an understanding of ourselves, part of how we actually become gay in the world, how we understand and explore and play with all those possibilities. So I probably don't need to tell you all of this. You might be able to recall an anecdote from your own life or a friend's story. But it's one of the most compelling arguments I can think of as to why diverse representation in games is crucial. And so to me, part of what this all suggests is not just that our brains are plastic or that sexuality is much more plastic and fluid, there's some other studies coming out recently that point towards that, or that games can affect all of these things and kind of push us around and mold us. It also points out that game designers are basically kind of stumbling around in the dark. I know this to be the case for having designed games with a lot of different people over the last couple decades. We're experimenters. A lot of us are trying to make new and better and different kinds of games, but we know much, much less about what we're doing, how we're playing with and affecting the human mind than the people doing the kinds of studies that I just mentioned. And even those people will readily admit that our knowledge of the human mind is extremely, extremely limited. At best, really great game designers kind of have an intuition of the possibilities of what might come out of a game. And we get really, really excited about that, about the fact that we don't know, the fact that we're not sure what might happen in a game that is kind of inherently unpredictable. That's part of what makes a game work. That there are weird things, glitches even, that can surprise us even if we've hand-coded every line. That someone who encounters our game might find a new, weird, different way to play it. It's almost a fetish for some designers, the fact that creating a game is a little bit less like inventing a device that we can understand what it's for, and a little bit more like discovering something weird and inhuman out there in the world that was maybe already there even before we stumbled across it. A system that doing something cool and exciting to our brains. And we're not sure what it is, but we like it. And the best guideline we have for that as a goal to try and guide our game design is that we're trying to find something that's fun. But that word fun can mean practically anything to anyone. It's kind of just a shorthand for saying that it's pleasurable to us. And game designer and theorist Ian Bogost has described fun as being like something that effervesces up from a game when you play it. So you sort of turn the crank of this game, and fun kind of comes out of it, like smoke coming out of an overheating engine, or static electricity coming off of a cat that you're petting. So we get excited when we see this weird thing happen. We can tell that it's affecting us, and we try to make as much of it as possible. We try to make it go on longer. We try to sort of make it more intense, go up and down. But sometimes we don't even really know why we're trying to do that. Well, there is one really obvious reason why, and it's because if you happen to stumble on a really effective combination of these elements, if you work really hard on it, believe in that idea, pursue that goal tenaciously, and never give up, you could one day live in a house that has a room entirely filled with candy, like Notch does. So if you find the fun, if you make this weird little system work for you and for other people, you can make serious bank. But is this really the be-all and end-all of this very long relationship between humans and games, this sort of instinctive symbiosis that has a disturbing amount of power to shape us? Well, there's a debate that's been going on for at least a decade or so that suggests that we should be thinking bigger than just fun and profit. So designers like Jane McGonigal, who is known for giving one of the most popular TED Talks on this topic, she believes really strongly that we should be harnessing games, putting them, and by extension ourselves, to work, solving the problems of the world. We should harness all this energy and turn it away from virtual worlds and imagined realities towards actual problems like hunger and water and better energy solutions and so forth. Or there's Ian Bogost again, who believes that among many other things, games should be used to help us understand the complexity in the world around us. The funny thing about these ideas, especially Jane's, is that I kind of feel like they're trying to take pleasure and put it to work. You know, sort of as if you were training that cat that's scratching your sofa to scratch a fabric wall on a perpetual motion hamster wheel, and then you're using it to power all of the Earth's energy needs by putting, one of these in every household with a cat. Because, cats like to scratch things, and, we can just get them to get to work for us. But these very questions are actually part of a much longer history. That's another aspect of this relationship between society and games. This question that comes up over and over again about whether games are pernicious or useful, whether there's something better that we could do with them, or whether they should be sort of considered harmful. Can games be rehabilitated, brought out of the darkness? Well, like I said, the most recent round of this was really concerned with whether video games cause violence. Before that, it was whether tabletop role-playing games could lead to players losing touch with reality or to becoming Satanists, thinking they could actually cast spells. But the story goes back much, much further than that. So this is a quote from 1924, a newspaper editorial that was written about crosswords, that crosswords were sort of a pernicious plague on society. They're not really games. People aren't really getting anything out of it. They're just sort of spinning their wheels, wasting time. It's not useful, right? It doesn't help you with your mental development. And the prominent newspaper that this was written in was actually the New York Times. And then 2 decades after this editorial was written, they sort of became the foremost venue for crossword puzzles in the country. And now it's sort of very prestigious. The crossword puzzle editor, Will Shortz, is sort of invited to speak about crossword puzzles. And there's still something that you do for fun on a Sunday morning, but they're also considered like an important part of culture, and that somehow the story has flipped a little bit, and now they're an interesting way of playing with words, of sort of solving riddles and sort of exercising your vocabulary, right? And we can go back a lot further and find other examples. So for instance, in the 19th century, the history of board games was at a point where most of the games being played, say in 19th century England, were being played in gambling houses like this one. And they had an unsavory reputation. That the idea of that if you were someone who played games, you were probably maybe a ruffian, maybe you were sort of growing dissolute, wasting your family's fortune, sort of getting caught up with all of these no-good types, spending all of your time drinking and gaming, and not doing something useful with yourself for the rest of society. So games were associated with gamblers and immorality, but there were some people who were interested in the potential of games and thought, we could actually make these useful, beneficial to society instead. And so what was going on at the time, Europe was industrializing, cities were growing larger, people were moving away from the countryside as farms were sort of consolidated into larger farms. And the new middle class in cities had a lot more leisure time that they were spending at home. Some of them even had gas lights in the evenings, and they could spend time with each other, sitting around, maybe reading if they were, a particularly pious family, maybe they were reading the Bible. But this also created an opportunity for a new kind of entertainment product, something for families to do with each other at home. So this is a board game called The Mansion of Happiness, where you used to roll the die and move your piece around the board, much like, games like Candyland. But there was meant to be a moral message instilled here. They were marketed as these socially responsible games that could improve you. They'll teach your kids about Christian sins and virtues and sort of like, what are bad things that you might need to avoid in life? Like, how can you become a good person? Well, don't land on this space in real life or in this game. And this tradition actually goes back a long ways, even back to ancient India, where the game Snakes and Ladders has its origin as a similar kind of thing, where you climb up a ladder when you encounter something good and virtuous, something you should be doing, and you slide down a snake when you fall into gambling or drinking or adultery. And this trend went on for a while. It's not long after the Mansion of Happiness that you get games like the checkered game of life. It's a slightly more secular direction. It's no longer as concerned with Christian values. It's promoting worldly values. Like in this game, you go to college, you get rich, you get married, you sort of climb up that escalator of adulthood. And it's worth noting that, so this idea of a morally instructive game was really popular, but that they had to take out certain elements that people thought were unsavory in games, right? So they couldn't include dice with these products because dice were associated with gamblers and dissolution and wasting your life away. So instead, they went back and they found this really ancient device called a teetotum. If this looks somewhat familiar to you, it may be because it resembles a dreidel, which is a very old form of teetotum. Used to play games, right? But the teetotum wasn't familiar to 19th century England, so they took that, they kind of put more numbers around the side, and this is a device that later evolved into the plastic spinners that you find in a lot of 20th century board games. So this turns out to be a very profitable and successful attempt to rehabilitate the image of games, to say, no, games don't just have to be a horrible waste of time for evil people, we can make them virtuous, because you might recognize the name of the designer is designed by a guy named Milton Bradley. so who went on to take the checkered game of life, decouple it from the checkerboard, and make it the game of life that you can go and buy in a Toys R Us now. So games lost this image of simply being a pastime for soldiers, drunks, and thieves, became a mainstay of family and home life, a wholesome thing that you do with your kids all throughout the 20th century. And if we go back even further than this, we find the roots of this association of games, playing cards and dice with fighting and drunkenness and sort of idle layabouts, going back all the way to the earlier part of the say like the 12th and 13th century, when rise in easier means of reproduction for playing cards meant that card games were spreading across Europe. And at that point, card games in some places were getting so out of hand, they started to become popular even with the wealthy of the city-states in Italy, like in Venice, that the government and the church decided to step in. So the Catholic Church, who had just been kind of unsuccessful in trying to just stamp out private gambling and making it totally illegal, they instead decided to open the first casino, which was called the Ridotto in Venice. And so this was the legitimized, controlled, and government-funded form of gaming, at least for the upper classes, so that since even though it was technically like this public institution that was open to everyone, the casino had this very strict elite dress code that effectively prohibited everyone except very wealthy people. So we see this story happening over and over again, where games start to get popular, especially in times when there's more wealth, there's more leisure time, maybe because of advances in productivity or the rise of the Italian city-states. When people have time and they have money to spend or to gamble with, that gaming grows and becomes a big concern. It becomes this concern to society, like, wait, where's all this excess that we could be harnessing is being turned towards pleasurable pursuits that seem to have no point. In part because I think it took a long time of creating games for us to realize, like, oh, actually these games are doing something to us. They're having an effect on our minds. They're useful to us somehow. And indeed, if we look at the rehabilitation of the crossword, similar thing happened to solitaire. For a long time, it was regarded as like a complete and total waste of time, like that only somebody who was really stupid and frivolous would play solitaire. It was considered a game only for young ladies. But then, several decades after solitaire became popular in the 19th century, people were talking about it differently. They were saying, oh, solitaire is a great way to just relax. You have such a busy day at work. The modern life is faster paced than ever before, and you can just let your mind rest and sort of play with numbers. It's maybe a little bit good and stimulating. So there's always this cycle of excess leisure, excess wealth, and then trying to, getting concerned about it, wondering, how come we're wasting all of this on games? And then saying, yeah, but maybe we can make games better or talk about how they're better, put them to better use. So what is a game player to do amidst all of these different kinds of messages that, games are a waste of their time, but you could use them to solve problems. You should support diversity in games, but don't play violent games, but maybe they could be educational, et cetera, et cetera. And some of those are totally safe to ignore, right? But all of these other mixed messages that go into this fraught conversation between games and society, trying to figure out whether games are a good thing that we as a whole culture should be investing more into, or whether we should really sort of keep them at arm's length, or maybe they should just be for kids. I think it's very tempting to throw our hands up and just say, you know what, I kind of just need to ignore all of these things. And usually that means there's one message left, right? That, hey, games are fun, they're really enjoyable, you should just find something that you like and play them. And this message never disappears because it's the one where the money comes from, right? So you have no worries about missing out on this message. Someone is always going to be trying to sell you a new fun game. But I think this raises some bigger questions, especially now that we're kind of thinking about this whole arc of the story. So take a bag of Doritos and take Candy Crush Saga. the food industry has gotten really, really good at figuring out exactly what works well in terms if you want to sell somebody a snack or something sweet. They know the combination of ingredients, right? There's the whole branch of chemistry that has to do with making these products more and more satisfying. And you can look on a nutrition label if you're really concerned. You can say, oh, this bag of Doritos is about half fat. Do I really want to eat it? And the interesting thing is, over the course of my career in games, people who make games have gotten more and more sophisticated, or at least we're trying to, stumbling around a little bit, because like I said, we're sort of like blind experimenters in some ways. But we've been trying to come up with what is the best formula for a game. Like, how can we put together all the combination of ingredients, the right amount of choices that make you feel sort of important and like you figured out what to do, like how you got the right level of reward, but maybe not too much. You're able to save the right amount, but like don't save it all the time, because then you'll feel like everything's meaningless, right? So that's what a lot of talks at conferences, especially like say the Game Developers Conference or conferences where designers gather, is to figure out like, oh, how do we do this better? How do we make a game? How do we reach this pinnacle? Like maybe Candy Crush is kind of sitting on top of the heap right now in terms of having got this formula down. But there are a bunch of different formulas for how to do this, just like there are a lot of different flavors of Doritos. They're all satisfying, depending on the mood that you're in. And maybe not even just Doritos. You can also eat sweet things, too, if you're looking for snack food, right? So I guess my point in all of this is that we have responsibilities to think about, not just as members of communities that are making games, as many of you maybe are, but also as players, right? That we have to be aware of the forces that are trying to shape our decisions. That when someone is trying to get you interested in a game, or when a new release comes out, you're all aware of marketing messages, right? But there are messages and formulas embedded in gameplay itself as well, right? That you're being catered to, made to feel important, that your buttons are being pressed in this stumbling, halting way that we kind of know how to summon up these fun feelings, even if we don't totally know the full extent of how it's affecting our mind. So you have to decide for yourself. I'm using a lot of metaphors about food and exercise in this presentation, not because I think it's a super direct analog. I do think that maybe there are games that you could say are better for you, worse than you, but mostly I don't really know, and I don't think anyone is really totally sure. So rather than saying you should play this type of game or you shouldn't play that type of game, sometimes I like to buy a large bag of Doritos and maybe I eat the whole thing when I'm sitting on the couch, and it's not so much that you need to become a vegan of games or sort of like figure out only what games are good for you, but that you should just be trying to think about it in a mindful, aware way, because the basic message amidst all these debates about games is that, hey, look, games are supposed to be for fun. You shouldn't be worrying about this at all. Just sort of go towards the light. Go towards that thing that makes you feel satisfied. Don't worry about all this, because the debates about whether games are useful, whether they are harmful, they cause a great deal of anxiety inside the game industry. There are lobbying groups in our industry now that exist solely to sort of try and shift those conversations in the favor of the industry. And so from the point of view of economics, the market for games doesn't necessarily want you to become a very carefully considered consumer. And it's hard to figure out what exactly the effect a game is having on you. And I actually think that given where we're at right now in terms of science, in terms of the art of game design, that players are just as equipped as anyone else to sort of understand how a game is affecting you. You have immediate access to your own experiences. You can reflect on them. In fact, games may be really useful as a tool for reflecting on your own mind, what's happening in your brain. Why did you feel disappointed when you couldn't do something? What was it like to feel that loss? What's it like to gamble and lose an enormous amount of money? You can actually see your own experiences because they're reflected and refracted through the structure of a game. You get to experience something that's not like losing your life savings on the stock market, but maybe just like losing an enormous amount because you screwed something up, or because of the randomness of chance, or because your friend decided to screw you over. It's not just about having that experience and getting something a little bit out of it, feeling satisfied and going on with the rest of your day, can also be useful for actually thinking about what's going on, how it's affecting you, right? So if you could think of it like an exercise machine, right? You have to think about exactly what you're doing and be mindful of the motions of your body. And another way that I would suggest thinking about games is that they're kind of like putting your brain in a Play-Doh factory. When you get really, really deep into a game, when it's kind of blocking out everything else, like the Tetris blocks falling, your brain is kind of, temporarily at least, adopting the shape that's been made for it in the mold of the structure of the game. It's shaping what you care about. It's shaping what you are concentrating on doing next. It's affecting your feelings too, right? You get like gamer face or something, depending on what you're playing. And that's worth paying attention to, not just sort of like skimming through and then forgetting. Like, you're eating that big bag of Doritos, you're kind of not even noticing the taste, right? And I feel like that's such a dominant mode for playing games, especially ones that are marketed to us with big marketing budgets, that it's worth just being a little more thoughtful about. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk about this at GaymerX is because I think that as queer gamers, we're actually especially well equipped to consider what it's like to have our desires marketed to us in ways that don't necessarily fit, right? That we're getting messages all the time that we're like, okay, this isn't exactly right, but there's a model being presented to us of like, well, here's how we should feel, here's how you are supposed to react. And then kind of having to struggle to figure out and understand what your own desires are, what your own tastes are, how you want to shape those, and then you figure it out, you struggle against the sort of the main line of marketing and how things are being sold or presented to you, what narratives are being constructed, and then maybe you find yourself in another box, right? You're like, oh, okay, the marketers have caught on to this. It's still the same thing happening, but they've widened it. And so you get more messages about what you're supposed to look like, or what your desire is supposed to shape around. But you can think about this as an individual and not just a category. And the same is true when you're playing games. So what I like to say is, it's totally worthwhile expanding your horizons, trying games of sorts that you've never heard before, maybe that you'd never considered. For me, for a long time, this was games played on social networks, Facebook games. I didn't really want to play them. I sort of found them distasteful. And I had to kind of train myself to try to understand what was actually interesting about them. And it took a lot of work. And the same is true for me now for the major sports game franchises. They're always a particular genre of game that I never touched, but that actually I think it is to my own benefit, in part because I'm a game designer and I also teach games, and I should try to understand more about them. But I think it can be true just as for anybody, because we live in this very interesting time where types of games, genres of games, new forms of gameplay are expanding at such an unparalleled rate. In part because, like I mentioned, we have computing technology that's been spurring this growth for many decades, but also because the technology is becoming more accessible to everyone, right? So it's as if we live in a country that for a long time had its borders closed, and you couldn't go outside or experience anything else, and then suddenly the gates went down, and you discovered there's all of these other types of cuisine out there that you can suddenly for the first time experience duck confit or Shanghai soup dumplings, and there's this enormous range out there that's just starting to be explored. So it's not just that diversity of people creating games is important for reasons that have to do with justice and fairness. Like, everyone should be able to access the same types of experiences. It's not just that it's a profitable thing, which is something that gets mentioned a lot, that, oh, actually, this makes sense for business to open up these new markets, to have more different types of people playing games. It's also that I think there's an expansion of human frontiers for expression and human communication that happen when we have more people getting involved in doing these kinds of unknown, uncertain experiments with a very powerful and kind of weird tool that affects our minds. and that we actually need more people, more different types of people to be doing this. I had a conversation maybe about 5 or 6 years ago now, shortly after the publication of Anna Anthropy's Rise of the Video Game Zinesters, which was kind of a galvanizing call to action to have more people making games. A senior colleague, a white guy who was very well respected, and a lot of people pay attention to what he thinks about games, asked me, he was like, I understand that it would be great, of course, that if more people were represented in games, if we had a greater diversity of game creators, it's good, it's just fair, it's just, right? But is games going to benefit from that, not just in terms of being able to sell things to more people, but is it going to make games better? And they said, yes, it's obvious that it's going to get better, right? And it's because the types of games that different types of people are going to make, from different backgrounds, different cultures, different experiences with gender and sex, and you name it, they're going to be different kinds of games. They're going to be things that you don't expect, because so far it's been limited. And now we're in this great period of expansion where we kind of have to question what our understanding of a game is, right? So there's this challenge now, I think, for players, that you kind of have to know what your boundaries are and then push them a little bit if you're going to be engaged in this ongoing evolution of games that's happening right now. So when someone first saw an oyster somewhere, there's an old joke, it's like, why would you think to eat that? It looks super disgusting, right? But then when if you actually taste it, oysters are super delicious. But we don't expect a kid to sort of pick up an oyster and be like, ooh, wow, I really want this, right? You actually have to learn, like, okay, this is feels a little weird and gross in your mouth, but it's okay, you should eat it, and it's actually really enjoyable. Or whiskey, right? Like, if you try whiskey for the first time, it's like you licked the inside of like a rotten tree, right? And it's like, why would you do this? But it's a taste that you can acquire. And I think that we're at a period in games now where, just like an expansion of cuisine in lots of different directions, there are many, many tastes that you can acquire. Now, I'm not saying that it's better to have like a more refined taste. I don't think it's necessary to get snooty about it, even as snooty as like places that serve flights of different types of whiskey. But there's potential there. There's potential there that you can explore and that you can make a difference in if you're willing to sort of take some more risks with your own taste. So I have plenty of friends who their diet kind of looks like this, right? They eat pasta with red sauce and French fries. Some of them eat like this because they're vegetarians. Some people eat very plain foods because they have some sort of difficult, bad experience with food in their lives, and they have a lot of issues around it, right? But those things aside, I can't help but feel bad for people that don't get to, for whatever reason, maybe just out of choice, right? Maybe just because this was what they grew up eating, and they're not ever exploring any further. Because this feels satisfying, right? This satiates their needs, it fills their cravings, it allows them to survive. Maybe, in terms of when it comes to food, just eating pasta and French fries is probably not the healthiest thing to do. But when it comes to games, we don't really necessarily need to exercise those faculties that we have. We can get by in life just sort of, flexing those same muscles over and over again, right? And nobody maybe will kind of notice because it's a lot more subtle. But if you're able to go beyond these types of cuisine, you get a much more varied experience of life. And I'm really hoping that the same is going to be true increasingly of games. Because if food culture looked like games culture does at the moment, it would be like this. Most of us would be eating these gigantic portions in these sprawling food courts with lots of different options in the food courts, different types of food court chains you could go to. There would be about 5 non-chain restaurants in San Francisco that would be sort of struggling to get by. But on most street corners, you could find someone who was like begging you to buy a cupcake from them at a really cheap price. And you'd be like, I'm not sure if I want to buy this cupcake. It costs 10 cents. And then there would be people sort of talking about like, I don't know if we should be serving salads here. And the salads aren't really real food, are they? So although invoking a lot of these examples about food and exercise may point towards some dangerous territory where we are all coping with a ton of messages all the time about what we should be eating, how much we should be exercising for our health. There's a lot of body shaming and stuff that gets caught up in that. But the situation with games, I think, is a little bit flipped, where right now, for the most part, we're encouraged just to think about games in this kind of model, like, oh, they're totally harmless, right? No, don't look over here, legislators who might be concerned about violence. Games they're just for fun. Don't worry about it, and you as players shouldn't worry about it either. So even though we don't really have any clear answers about what kind of game might be good for you, I actually want players to start figuring that out more and more for ourselves. Right? And I think it's totally possible because no matter what, games will change you when you play them, and it's worth embracing that because in changing, you'll also help to change the terrain of games for the future and affect the course of culture. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. And I don't know if we have time for questions or where we're at on the clock. 5 minutes? I'm happy to take questions if anybody wants to. Are you going to go around with a mic?
Hi, thank you so much for the really thoughtful talk. You got me thinking a lot about when you were talking about mindfulness and of this media, and it got me thinking a lot about just mindfulness in everything is really important in terms of thinking about how it's affecting us. And I better have a question at the end of this. I'm wondering about your perspective in terms of, like, I get the same kind of like stomach-turning reaction when I see a little kid with an iPhone or an iPad right in front of them playing whatever game they are, as I do if I see a little kid with a big old soda right in front of them. And I'm wondering about the older generation, how they aren't really thinking about this new media in terms of how it's impacting their kids. Us adults can hopefully be mindful as we'd like to be, but the little kids aren't, they can't think about how this media is as influential and in terms of brain plasticity as it's the most, I think, influential as any other media that's come so far. And just what you might think about that, and also in terms of how this new media, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think of this as a way that games industry and the culture around games has kind of failed parents more than anyone, because our conversation and our tension around things like, no, don't keep talking about how video games are violent, those studies were debunked, and arguing back and forth have pushed things into this polarized black and white picture, right? Like, well, either you believe that games are bad for you or you believe that they're good for you. Either there's something that you don't have to worry about, just let the kids play whatever they want, or, oh man, we have to be really careful and try to find games that are good for you. And what are games that are good for you? Well, there are some people trying to offer you answers, right? It's like, oh, this educational game, have your kid play that. And those games are kind of bad. They're kind of bad in part because they're sort of trying to do that, putting the cat on the endless treadmill thing of just harnessing pleasure and turning it in this different direction for education, and not thinking about this core activity of, oh, games can actually exercise parts of your mind, but we don't really know enough about how that works. Maybe we'll get there one of these days, but we certainly know, like, just having a kid only play a certain kind of like grindy game, just playing Dragon Veil over and over again for 8 months or something, is only going to work out certain parts of their mind. So it would be totally fine, but it also probably needs to be mixed up with other things. And I actually think that people who play a lot of games are better equipped to parent kids, right? You kind of know intuitively, like, oh, maybe you shouldn't be playing that all the time. Try this other thing along with it. And I think those intuitions, those instincts are maybe some of the best guides that we have as players start making more games. Maybe one of these days we'll have an artisanal culture of people who play a lot of games, making games for their own kids and being like, here's what I think is really interesting that I want to say to you with this game. I just look forward to that. Yeah. And back there.
I'd really like to jump off on that because it's so interesting. I'd like to hear you talk about what do you think, how do you think that ties into the narrative in terms of mainstream games, of how we sort of just treat games as this amorphous blob of like, yeah, they're games. They all play the same. They're all the same thing. There's sort of a narrative in our culture that games are just a singular pursuit, and that isn't the same for many other sort of art forms. I don't know, and how that ties into the inability of the industry to ever approach those conversations.
Right, and I think it's because games, at least in the current explosion that's been going on since the 70s, are still relatively new, and we still have a whole generation around that are like, what is this new thing? It seems monolithic. And I'm just hoping that over the course of the 21st century, we'll just get a little bit more nuanced about it. It may take a really long time, because for the longest time, games were not being designed consciously as objects that were, like, say, authored by one person. That's only happened starting in the 20th century and the late 19th century. So it's no surprise that we're sort of stumbling around in the dark a little bit more than, say, with a song or a poem or something like that, right? It's been, which they've been around as long as games, but games are mostly created more unconsciously for the longest amount of time. So that's both great and interesting in a lot of ways, but also comes with some downsides. All right, I think back there and then over here.
Actually, it's along those lines. You know, you have early Hollywood where the industry is very, very tightly controlled by the industry until about the 50s or 60s or something, when they started getting a critical taste-making culture around what used to be just considered yet another distraction. You know, out of the HUAC and all the other things that kind of came as a reaction to that. There's an industry and cultural resistance to taste-making kind of, you know, game file, for lack of a better word, ludophile or something.
Yeah, and
culture. Yeah,
I think it's actually in part because of the legacy of other media, where you see that pendulum swinging back and forth, or even in certain genres of music, where if a sort of tastophile culture becomes really, really strong and kind of dominates criticism, that's what, say, film critics like Pauline Kael were reacting to, right? Like, oh, this has gotten a little bit too hoity-toity and refined. It's actually become less accessible to a large number of people. But games, I think, right now, that's less our concern. We're sort of swung very far in the other direction. So I think maybe there's a balance somewhere in the middle
really
here.
benefited. I'm sorry to. Hollywood really benefited from that, though.
Yeah.
Eventually, it was.
Yeah, from the
having
pendulum
that
going back
taste-making
and forth.
culture, and now we have a much more like educated public when it comes to movies.
Right, I agree.
And, yeah.
So can I take one last question? You had your hand up over here.
I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on like this idea of, and maybe the dissonances in like games as tools versus games as like expressive platform. Like Jane McGonigal really falls hard on the side of games as tools for improving culture and society and stuff. But there's a lot of other people, maybe like Bogost and stuff, that really fall more on the idea of games as expressive platforms.
Yeah, I think so. This talk is sort of maybe a critiquing the notion of games as tools, right? That actually we can, if we think about them as tools, we have to think about them really expansively. I think, yeah, you can absolutely flip that, as you can with any kind of craftsmanship, any kind of art. Even people making chairs, right? Like you could think of a chair as a tool, but it's also an art form. And so there's immense value in the expression right there, right? And I think that, you know, obviously that's part of this whole narrative about, well, who gets to make games, right? But to me, that's almost like I can take that as a given, right? That there's enormous value in that people get to make games, that potentially everyone could be making games, and I think that topic has exploded in recent years, to the extent that what I'm worried about more now is not that more people will make games, because I think that'll happen, but that we'll have so many games made that very few of them are going to get played. Right? So this conversation about taste is pretty important, because if we all participate in shaping a taste culture and thinking about like what games are for, what are they interesting, how can they push us or challenge us or maybe defy our expectations somehow, that opens the way for more types of games to exist. Yeah, and that's, I think, is the necessary prerequisite for expression being more valuable. Okay, thanks very much. I'm out of time.